Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today we have another video about the ABIT BP6, the dual Celeron board. Now here I have two CPUs. One is a 400 MHz version and the other one is a 533 MHz version. I want to figure out if we can run two different CPUs in that motherboard. Apparently, it is possible to run two different models on the same motherboard. I don't know what's going to happen, but I do know that the frontside bus will be 66 MHz for both CPUs, and one CPU will have a multiplier of 8, and the other one will have a multiplier of 6. And those are fixed, so there is no overclocking going on, and also the fastest CPU is not supposed to downclock. So in that case, we should have a board that runs a 400 MHz CPU and a 533 MHz CPU. Now, the 400 MHz version is the slowest model I have, unfortunately, and the 533 is the fastest model I have. Actually, it's the fastest model that is available in the Mendocino lineup. So let's start with the 400 MHz version. I just want to see if it works. And then we can try the same thing with the 533 MHz version. And then we will try to mix and match. So I think that will be interesting. As benchmarks, I will use PCMark 04 and Quake 3 Arena, because both of these applications support multiple processors. Additionally, I will use Windows 2000 as an operating system, 256 MB of memory, and a Radeon 9000 Pro. The board is equipped right now with two Mendocino 466 MHz models. We can verify this by switching between the two sockets. Both of them are at 466 MHz. Here are the CPU-C benchmark numbers, so 765 and 3342. And we have very nice numbers here. We have exactly 1111 points in PCMark 04. Okay, let's move on to Quake. On the Quake 3 Arena shortcut, we need to add one parameter, plus set r_smp1. So this apparently should now enable Quake 3 to run using multiple threads. .9 frames per second. So apparently it doesn't really matter in which CPU socket you put the new CPU in, but I will use CPU socket 1, which is the one that's right above the BX chipset. Okay, the 400 MHz Mendocino is in the system. Let's see if the system powers on. Oh? Yes, we do. We have a single core system now. And I think, yes, so CPU is unworkable. This is because before I had the 466 MHz set in the BIOS. So let's go into the BIOS and change that. So yeah, this one defaulted now back to the slowest model, but you can change this. So before I had 466, now we have to go to 400. And what we see immediately is that we can no longer select the socket. It's grayed out. We only have one core now. Otherwise, Mendocino more or less all the same, except for the core speed. We are now at 400 MHz. The multiplier also went down from 7 to 6. Here are the benchmark scores. I'll write all of these numbers together and have them later on in a nice graph. So we'll see all CPU configurations and the individual tests. Okay, and we're done. 722 PC marks. The score is definitely lower than just reducing the frequency by 66 MHz. The benchmark definitely made use of the second CPU before. That was quite good. Let's see. What score did we get? 32.8 frames. I thought there is a bigger difference, and I really don't believe that the graphics card is the limiting factor here. But we will see now what happens when we move on to a single Mendocino clocked at 533 MHz. I think this core voltage is not correct. It should be 2 volts if I'm not mistaken. But we have 533 MHz, a multiplier of 8, and a bus frequency of 66. Let's run our benchmarks quickly. Okay, and we get 873 and 3,798 points. Oh, so it reads vCore of socket 1. So you see vCore 1, this is socket 1, and socket 1 is empty for me right now. So it reads 1.3 volts. I should have changed the socket in CPU Z. Okay. So yeah, the selection is grayed out. I cannot change the socket. I would have to select socket number 2. So yeah, it's a little bit unfortunate now. But anyway, doesn't matter. We know that the voltage is correct on socket number 2. It was at 2 volts in the BIOS. So let's run PC Mark 04. Okay, and we have a score of 877. So yeah, this is definitely slower than the dual Mendocino 466 setup, but the graphics score again remains identical to what we have seen before, and the CPU score is now 833. Okay, so last test we want to run is Quake 3, and we score 36.7 frames per second. So this is definitely slower than a dual CPU system, where we almost reached 40 frames per second. So this is our sample with a 533 MHz version of the Mendocino. But now let me add the 400 MHz Mendocino to our existing 533 MHz Mendocino and see how the system reacts. Okay, 2 different CPUs are now in the system. One Mendocino with 533 MHz and one with 400. Okay, 533 megahertz, 2 CPUs. Let's go into the BIOS quickly. And I want to check where is the temperature chipset features. Here we are. Okay, so we have both vCores set to 2 volts, and I think we don't get more. But is the 400 megahertz Mendocino now overclocked to 533 megahertz? Let's find out. And we are almost in Windows. That is interesting. I'm curious what we see in CPU Z now. So socket 1 has a 533 megahertz CPU. And we have a second socket. So what will we see here? Excuse me? So by hovering over it, it already changes. Okay, on the UI, if I hover over the second socket, it changes. Anyway, but the second CPU runs at 400, so I have one 533 and one 400 megahertz CPU in a dual socket system. Wow, okay. Let's see what benchmark numbers we get here. I'm not sure if we are getting closer to 400 megahertz results or to 533, because this benchmark is most likely single-threaded. And I think this is more of a 533 megahertz result. Anyway, we will look at the charts later. Oh no. So I tried this multiple times now. It looks like in the graphics benchmark I always get this error. I will run the test again without the graphics benchmark because it looks like the graphics score is always identical. At least I didn't see any difference between the 400, the dual 466 and the 533 megahertz version. So I'll just not run this benchmark anymore. And please don't crash this time. Okay, that's not correct. Maybe I should try again. Maybe a restart of the system will help. Let's see if we get a different score. Yeah, so it looks like we have a problem with PC Mark and 2 different CPUs on this motherboard. So no scores here, but now let's try Quake 3 Arena multi-threaded. Oh, 40.1. This is the highest score so far, which is a little bit unsurprising, but it is a little bit faster than 2 466 megahertz CPUs. That's interesting. Just 0.2 frames. I guess it's within margin of error, to be honest, but anyway. So I will test the 533 MHz version, and then if nothing goes wrong, we'll go right to the charts. And with two similar CPUs, both clocked at 533 MHz, we get a score again in PC Mark 04. So it really could be that there is something off if we have two different CPUs installed in this motherboard. But what I want to figure out now is what happens if I rebuild the previous configuration, the 400 and the 533 MHz CPUs, but I will flip them. Basically, the 400 MHz CPU goes in the other socket where the 533 was inside, and vice versa. I have a feeling that we will get lower scores. And that is because most likely Windows will just assume both CPUs are identical and starts with the first CPU that it finds and runs all single-threaded applications on that CPU. That would mean that it does make a difference in which socket the slower CPU goes in. Let me set up the system again with two different CPUs, but this time I will swap the sockets. The slower one goes in the other socket from the previous run, and then let's see what benchmark results we get. Okay, so the slower CPU is now in socket number 2, as shown here in this graphic. Before it was in socket 1. Let's see what we get. Okay, so it looks like we see the frequency of socket number 2 that is reported by the BIOS. And surprisingly, we didn't get any error message right now from the BIOS that it can't work with the CPU. So, I don't know. Very interesting. Okay, and in CPU-C, you see now 400 MHz in socket number 1. Maybe it's just wrongly labeled in the manual, because according to CPU-C, socket number 1 is closer to the I/O ports. So, and this one is our 533 model right now. Let's see what benchmark results do we get. Either the values of 533 MHz or 400 MHz. Okay, so the CPU speed definitely doesn't make any sense, and this is something very similar that we saw in PC Mark 04. Let's just quickly see the FPU speed, 2860, 2800. So it does look like this is the score of the 400 MHz version. Let's run this benchmark again and see if this again... Yeah, I think it already... Oh, okay, now we get 656. Okay, so it clearly runs on the slower CPU. I don't want to run PC Mark because that didn't work previously. Let's see what Quake is doing. .1 and 39.1 is 1 frame slower than we had before when the CPUs were flipped in the sockets. So it looks like it does make a difference. It absolutely does make a difference which CPU is in which socket. Windows definitely assigned the same resources to CPU-C. It was not able to take advantage of the 533 MHz model. Quake somehow does, because if I run it on the 400 MHz version, I'll get only 32 frames, but we got now 39. That is a little bit slower than two 466 versions, but in the other configuration where the two CPUs, the 400 and the 533 MHz versions were flipped, we got 40.1 frames per second. So it absolutely does make a difference in which order the CPUs are installed. Of course, there's an issue that some of the benchmarks didn't work properly, so that's a totally different issue. But yeah, if you have more information about this, please write it in the comments. Okay, let's have a look at the numbers. CPU-C is more or less straightforward. 400 MHz, 466, 533. The frequency of the CPU that is installed in socket 2 is determining the speed of the system. So you can see that between 533 plus 400 or dual 533, the score remains identical for FPU and for the CPU speed. It gets interesting, however, if we flip the two CPUs. Then the score drops to the level of a 400 megahertz CPU, and there was no way for me to change it. Even if I modified the affinity in Windows, the score remained low. So that is very interesting, and I would like to know your input on this. Were you aware of this phenomena, or did I do something wrong? Please let me know in the comments. I'm really curious if you could leave performance on the table. Now, I'm fully aware that you shouldn't run two different CPUs in a dual system like this one. You should always have two identical CPUs with the same speed, with the same cache, with everything identical, because we have seen that there were issues. Some benchmarks crashed and couldn't complete. Some benchmarks just gave weird results, and there were all kinds of weird behavior when it came to measuring performance. Let's move on to PC Mark 04. So this was one of these benchmarks. We couldn't complete PC Mark 04 when there were two non-identical CPUs installed in the board. But all the other configurations, it doesn't matter if it was single or dual CPU setup, they worked fine. Let's compare the two single CPUs first, 400 MHz and 533. Yes, you see higher performance on the 533 MHz version. But then if we look at the dual 466 MHz results, you see that it can outperform the fast single CPU. And that is because PC Mark 04 is aware of multiple CPUs and can split the workload and test the compute power of both your CPUs. So that's great. We move up a little bit when we increase to 533 MHz, but using two 533 MHz CPUs will not double the speed over one single CPU. So we went from 833 to 1190. And the overall PC Mark score went from 877 to 1213. So yeah, the increase is maybe 25 to 30%, something like that. So it's not double. Let's move on to our final benchmark results, and this is Quake 3. And here looks like it's all over the place. Let's look at the single cores first. So we started with 32 frames, almost 33 frames, and with an increasing clock speed, we went up to 36.7. So yeah, this is a nice increase, 4 frames more. But you can see that Quake 3 Arena definitely takes advantage of a multi-CPU setup. How much the improvement is? Well, you can see this here in the chart. So this was something where I was a little bit disappointed because the increase was not as much as I hoped. But, well, let's go through the results anyway. So we almost get 40 frames per second if we use dual 466 CPUs. When we move up to 533 MHz, both CPUs, we get a little bit less than 2 frames more to 41.6 frames per second. Now, if we plug in two different CPUs, the 400 plus the 533 MHz version, it depends on where you install the CPU. And if the slower CPU is put in the socket above the north bridge, or CPU 1, as it is marked here in the manual, you will get 40.1 frames. If you flip the two CPUs, you get 1 frame less. So if the 400 MHz version is put into the socket that is labeled as CPU number 2. And here you have it. This is what happens when you install two different CPUs in the ABIT BP6. So, and now we are at the end of the video. Let me know in the comments what you think about this project. Did you have the ABIT BP6 and try to run it with two different CPUs? And did you notice there was a difference in performance with such a setup when you flipped around the CPUs? Now, I say it again, you should not run a multi-socket motherboard with different CPUs. They should be identical. But I thought it's a nice experiment, and I think this was something interesting. And this is all for today. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you want to support my work, you can head over to Patreon. I want to thank all the Patreons that are already there and supporting my work. Thank you so much. I will see you in the next video. Take care and bye-bye.